Alright, listen. This channel is irrelevant to you, but you could consider me lucky for having you here. Welcome. My name is Zeno, and we're about to play some PS1 games on an original Xbox. Now, does that matter today? Probably not, considering we have other devices that could do the PlayStation emulator more than justice than what a 20+ year console could do at this point. Besides, it's not like you're being told to go out of your way to get yourself an Xbox and play PS1 games this way. In fact, this is all just for fun, to show you what it's capable of. And to top it off, there are a couple franchises that didn't make it to the original Xbox, so this sort of makes up for that. Now before we start, a man named Xenon Xyanide deserves his credit and praise for going out of his way to fix up the emulator. It was sort of left in the dust at version 18, 19, that could be wrong, you're more than welcome to correct me. But once he picked this up and played around with it, we're now looking at version 25, still beta by the way. But regardless, it still works miles better than what it did many years ago. Although there are some games that aren't fully compatible as of yet, some of which require a lot of tinkering in the configuration menu. Now on his latest version, he's already configured about 500+ games, and showing off that many would be insane. So we'll go through a short list of what games actually work pretty well, and on the way you'll also see some games that either don't work or run really laggy. And why not? If you got yourself a converter for your Xbox, you may as well throw in a PlayStation controller to make this authentic. Yeah, it's not an official controller made by Sony, but you get the idea. Alright, so let's go over this configuration menu before we get started, because in case you want to go ahead and try it out for yourself, you should at least know some of the basics, like BIOS mode for example. Now this is mainly stayed in BIOS, but another setting is called HLE, in other words, high level emulation. To my knowledge on this list, there's only just one. There's only one game that uses the HLE, because all the other times it's been used in other games, they don't work really well, or just straight up not boot. This emulator core versions are 1.4, 1.5, and 1.5 reloaded. The GPU settings go from 1.12, 1.15, 1.18, and there's also two different settings added on here, the UNI and old, and we'll get back to that later. The SPU settings can be switched between 1.6, 1.9, and 1.10. There's also the Franz option, and to my knowledge this hasn't been used in any of the games tested on here. Under graphics fixes, the majority of the showcase you'll only be concerned with 4 different settings on here: old frame skip, lazy updates, frame skip, and frame limit. Under CPU fixes, we'll only focus on these 3 right here: frame limiter for FMV, disable CDDA, and Xbox bias. If the core is under 1.5, use new CD code will be provided as an option to use. And there's only a couple games that use this setting. Now just as the title says here, you only need to use the Vandal Heart or Parasite Eve fixes when playing either of those games, sequel included. Under SPU fixes, sound timer method is also kept at original. If anything else, we'll switch it over to threaded. And if there is a large game that you're playing, you'll want to keep the sound buffer size at large. Wait CPU action is for Metal Gear Solid, not VR missions, and IRQ is for CTR, Crash Team Racing. Alright, with all that said, let's get started, yeah? The first one on the list is Oddworld Ape Odyssey. Yeah, this one does really well. This has a couple stutters and graphical glitches that'll appear when going into the next screen, or an explosive that happens like your death scene. If that happens, you can track back and forth and this actually gets fixed. It's still possible to progress through the game. As you can see, here's the third part of the game after leaving Raptor's farm. The cutscenes actually play out really well. You come to find certain game titles that have FMVs capped at 15 frames per second at full speed. This is also how it would play on the original PlayStation. Ape Odyssey is capped at 30 frames per second during gameplay, and despite it saying 31, it's full speed throughout. Oddworld Ape's Exodus, or Exodus. Someone out there is going to correct me. Menu loads up fine and the intro plays okay, but once you start a new game, it doesn't load at all, even after tinkering with all the different settings like changing the cores, switching GPU to UNI, or even HLE, it refuses to pass through the loading screen. Which is a shame, because if you did, you would have the ability to play all of the Oddworld games, including the ones exclusive to the original Xbox at the time, like Munch's Odyssey and Stranger's Wrath. At least Abe's Odyssey works fine, but not Exodus. Ape Escape. There's two different settings to try out here. Switching between 1.5 Reloaded and 1.4 will offer the same results, but may vary depending on the stages you encounter. The second is keeping the core at 1.4 and changing the GPU setting to U9. The GPU U9 offers a better performance in my opinion, but leaving these two options out here will offer you the choice on which is better. My suggestion could be wrong, but that's where other testers come in. But regardless though, Ape Escape came a long way just to work on the original Xbox, and as you can see here, it's manageable to complete.
Capcom versus SNK.
Who else is excited for CVS's return for the second fighting game collection on the modern consoles, well anyway, going through the menu is a bit slow and it stays around 50 frames per second, at its lowest is 45. But as soon as the game starts, it's full speed throughout the whole fight. Now it will occasionally drop frames below 60, but stays steady in between 58 and 60. But you can get through this game enjoyably. However, as nostalgic as the first game is, CVS 2 on the original Xbox is a better option to play. Castlevania, Symphony of the Night. Xenon Xyanide already had these settings set, and there was nothing for me to change about it except Xbox bias, which is now set to normal. The Xbox bias overclocks the emulator, so if it ever does slow down, you can go back to CPU fixes and switch the bias back. This is as close to playing Symphony of the Night natively on the original Xbox, and it's nearly perfect. There are going to be some dips on the frame rate, but it's overall steady. One thing to remind you all is that because this is the original PlayStation, going back or pressing cancel is set to triangle and not circle, so don't get confused by pressing B isn't doing anything. You have to press Y to go back or cancel.
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
It was not by my hand that I'm once again given flesh. I was called here by humans who wish to pay me tribute.
Tribute? You steal men's souls and make them your slaves.
Crash Bandicoot 2. Cortex Strikes Back.
Now once again, these are Xenon Xyanide settings here. Attempting to change anything else will result to either slowing the game down, make the game faster but choppy, or the music downright can't play right. Cutscenes will play out but has a major audio sync problem that can't keep up with the video frame rate. During gameplay, frames will jump between 20 to 25 frames per second, and sometimes steady at 20. You get better results from playing Ape Escape rather than Crash 2. Now although it's playable, you'll have some slowdowns here and there and every now and then a stutter.
Bandicoot War!
The only change from Xenon Xyanide setting is changing the Xbox bias to faster. It's still the same results as the second game, and for the longest time on earlier builds, it was unbearable. There are some slowdowns and occasional stutters that occur, but it tries to stay above 20 frames per second. Cutscenes slightly sync the audio, but once we reach the scene of the home of the Bandicoots after Uka Uka's freedom, it freezes. So it's best to just skip those. Crash Team Racing, or in other words, CTR. This one is going to look a little ugly simply because of removing high res and enabling low res. Now without these settings, CTR won't be able to run well. Now if you own a CRT television or a monitor, it would help out the low res look compared to a monitor TV, because unfortunately, this is the only time where applying filters won't necessarily help with the visuals you see here. Overall, CTR is steady in between 25 to 30 frames per second, miles better than the 2 Crash Bandicoot games before this one. Now before we move on, PCSXbox has hardware and software filters to change the look of your games. Now in my personal opinion, it's best to use either trilinear or anisotropic filters under hardware filters. These filters don't affect your game's performance unlike the software filters. These will push the limits of your Xbox, and sometimes these settings are good to use or it becomes too hard to handle. There's only a few games that are left using this filter, mainly the 2D side scrollers. But take precaution that if your game lags, you'll want to turn that off. Now moving on, we're going to try out Duke Nukem Time to Kill. And it took me a long time to get this working as well as possible, and as such, these are the best results that could do just that. It's not perfect, but it does well enough to play through. It has choppy moments here and there, and that dips under 20 frames per second, especially if it gets to a point where it's running too fast. But most of the time, it's steady at 20-25 frames per second. This is where you actually want to make use of the PC FPS calculations, and if it gets too choppy, you can try reverting the Xbox bias back to normal to solve that issue. It's left on because this prevents the game from slowing down.
Lock and load. All aboard!
Gex 3. Well, for the most part, it runs. Although the intro and menu is on the slow end, cutscenes play out alright, capping at 15 frames per second. And why does this man remind me of the news reporter from Rampage 3? The story of this game always seemed to escape my mind, like Gex trying to act like Austin Powers, who has to save some government agent. The gameplay in of itself is alright though. It jumps between 20 to 30 frames per second and dips depending on how much stuff is happening on screen. It seems playable half the time, and other times it can be a little choppy on the frame rate.
I think your friend Rex might need a bit of a thought.
Auditions for The Shining right this way. This place is colder than Eva Gabor's wig fridge.
Soul Reaver. The game works, but for it to run, you have to disable high res and enable low res, and it's an uglier look, but at the very least, passable. Playing CTR on low res looks way better than Soul Reaver, and that game is dark in contrast. It's still not a good recommendation anyway, seeing as there's still some graphical glitches that pop up, such as a teal filter screen that randomly shows when you're roaming in the spiritual realm. And if you ask me, although PlayStation is the version a lot of fans grew up with, myself included, the Dreamcast is the best version to play the original Soul Reaver, unless you plan on waiting for that remaster this December. The only Legacy of Kain series released on the original Xbox was Blood Omen 2 and Defiance.
You are young yet, Raziel. You still retain many of your vampiric weaknesses. Immersion in water, while not fatal, will dissolve your physical body, forcing your return to the spirit world. Be aware that in the spectral realm, water has neither heft nor lift. It stands as thin as air.
Legend of Mana. Nearly flawless. You may as well call this a native port. Although it always had a problem with the cursor sound effect, mainly just set to a high-pitched tone. Most of it is gone. Every now and then it creeps up on you strangely, but other than that, a stutter or two that happens during gameplay once in a while, and it's actually really good. Now if it does stutter more than often, you can turn off frame skip and see if that would change anything. Mega Man 8. Two different settings with similar results. Either way, they both work as intended without so much problems. The frame rate will drop a few times in certain stages, but if it doesn't satisfy you, there's always the Mega Man Anniversary Collection released on the original Xbox that contains Mega Man 8 in it. Mega Man Legends, my personal favorite. Other than Ape Escape, this was the first game completed here on the PCSXbox on an early version 22, and it was a grand adventure. It still works on the newer version as it did on the older builds. The frame rate stays in between 25 to 30 frames per second at full speed. There are some occasional drops that happen when going up against a boss, but other than that, in my opinion, this is considered to be a fine port. Now, one thing to note here is that some individuals complain about how the controls haven't aged well, and that's only because of how awkward it was to have the shoulder buttons act as your character turning. And the beauty about emulators is that we can remap our controls. So what you want to do is keep your movement on the left thumbstick on strafe control, then remap the shoulder buttons to the right analog. So L1 would be right thumbstick to the left and R1 to the right. This in a way acts as a camera movement, minus the longitude. If you ever want to try this game or go back to it, try out this control scheme and watch how better it plays.
Mega Man, are you alright?
Mega Man Legends 2. The second game has different settings and has to run under 1.5 preloaded, along with either Unite GPU or old. This is your only method of booting the game. Other than that, it may not run as fast as the first, but it still plays well enough to get by. The only big downside of this experience is the beginning part of the game where the ship is on fire and getting past the snow island. These two parts really push the limits on this emulator, and it's something you have to bear past it to get to where the grass is much greener on the other side of things. Only then you'll see that the game goes right back to being steady for good. Mega Man X 4 and 5. Two different settings here, and both will run the same way on both games. One setting is for mind and the other is Xenon Xyanide. And in case one doesn't work well, you have another to fall for. It does run better than Mega Man 8, almost perfect if you ask me, but with a few dips in frame rate that happens when there's too much going on the screen. But 95% along the way, it's pretty smooth. Metal Gear Solid. The good news is that this game runs pretty well that you could consider saying that on the original Xbox you can play the original Metal Gear 1 and 2 on the NES emulator, Metal Gear Solid on PCSXbox, and Metal Gear Solid 2 released on the original Xbox. Metal Gear Solid runs in between 25 and 30 frames per second. At times it feels just a little slow during a couple sections, but for the most part you can get through the game no problem. There was a time on the earlier builds of this emulator after beating Ocelot that the game would freeze during Snake and President Baker's dialogue. This no longer happens and you can get past that with ease. but just to be certain in case it does, save the game before the fight and save state after the fight. Metal Gear Solid VR missions. Well, you got 4 Metal Gear games that'll run on the original Xbox. You want another one? Well, here you go. VR missions works too. Full speed, 30 frames per second tops. We all wish we can get Metal Gear Solid 3 on here, but that never happened until the 360. Anyway, VR missions uses different settings than the original Metal Gear Solid. This time you'll want to disable the wait CPU action since you won't need that. Mortal Kombat 4. Now this was a tough one to get working, believe it or not. It's not perfect, nor is it terrible. It's considered to be fast enough with minor glitches and stutters. Mortal Kombat 4 is capped at 30 frames per second and drops at 25 at the lowest, but it runs at full speed, so the only issue that happens is the frame rate drop.
Scorpion wins.
Mortal Kombat Trilogy. With the new CD code switched to rearmed, everything can be left as default and you can play like this. If you discover any problems along the way, these alternative settings should help out. It's not much, but it does suggest some improvements. Parasite Eve. It seems to work just fine. It's capped at 30 frames per second, although it does say 31, which is strange. There was a stutter or two that happened while playing the beginning, but nothing major or game breaking. But do keep in mind that when you pause the game, the screen is left at a standstill, almost like how the retro games would be paused. So don't take this the wrong way thinking that the game froze. It just happens to look like this when pausing the game. It's a little strange since it's supposed to dim the stream when pausing. As for the cutscenes, they play out alright, even in FMVs. Parasite Eve 2. That works just as well as the first one did. If things don't go accordingly, you could try setting the Xbox bias to faster if that makes a difference. However, for the most part, it stays above 50 and below 60 frames at full speed. The music will stutter from time to time, but goes back to normal as such. Now there will be a scene or two you come across that will slightly sync the audio, but this doesn't happen a lot as far as experience goes.
You want to know what's going on? Let me tell you the story of Rayman!
For the longest time, Rayman didn't even want to work on this emulator. But now, with the new CD code activated, Rayman is finally playable on the original Xbox, and at full speed. So if you like to torture yourself with this punishing game, well then, there you go. All power to you. Resident Evil Director's Cut. Xyanide already configured all 3 Resident Evil games on the PCSXbox at your convenience. This is the DualShock version of the game, so analog sticks can be used. FMVs for the most part play well, and it stutters only a couple times, but both video and audio are synced in just right. Gameplay is nearly perfect. A couple times it will randomly stutter and drops a frame rate or two, but for the most part, it runs full speed at 95% performance.
Wesker? Jill? What happened to Jill and Wesker?
Resident Evil 2.
It amazes me how both GameCube and the PlayStation 2 got their share in Resident Evil games. RE4, RE Remake, and RE0 for the GameCube, RE Code Veronica X, and RE4 which came out later on the PlayStation 2. But Xbox got nothing. Which is crazy because Capcom was putting out all their other games and the closest we got that resembles Resident Evil was on Emulation. Now it wasn't until the 360 they finally got Resident Evil 4 and 5, but let's get back on topic here. Resident Evil 2 runs just as well as the first one does. FMVs play okay for the most part, but the audio will slightly start to sync about halfway through the cutscene. In-game cutscenes will have a hiccup out of the blue, but it plays better than the FMVs. Gameplay is solid 60 frames per second with occasional dips that happen when too much is happening on screen. Go figure. But this more than makes up for what the Xbox has missed out on. Resident Evil 3, and then of course the third game, which to my surprise plays nearly perfectly. The game runs at 30 frames per second and will sometimes drop to 25 frames or lower, but because of its full speed performance, those frame drops are hardly noticeable. In-game cutscenes and even FMVs are played at almost exactly like the original, and it was hard to notice any stuttering, frame drops, or even audio syncing. Everything worked just fine. Out of the 3 games, Resident Evil 3 has the best performance.
Get away!
Oh, this one was very picky, at least on my version with Xbox 1.2. Almost every configuration that was set up wouldn't boot the game and freeze the Xbox. All but one made it on here, and these exact settings shown here is the only way that will get this game to boot. Regardless, it's nearly full speed, but it isn't nearly perfect. That's also the same case with the frame rate. You'll notice some of the sounds like the main menu and background music are turned off, and that is because of the XA sound option under SPU fixes turned off. This doesn't necessarily disable the CD digital audio, rather just mute it. It's not recommended to disable it either, otherwise this prevents the game from booting as well. The X8 is turned off because the music has slowdowns. We're going to go ahead and jump into the Spyro trilogy. Xenon Xyanide has provided settings for both Spyro 1 and 2. The first game runs well with minor slowdowns and stutters, but overall the best performance out of the trilogy on this emulator.
When you free a dragon or step on one of their platforms, you're saving your progress. That could be useful if you run into trouble. Not that you ever run into trouble, Spyro.
Now the second game does have some trouble keeping itself stable at times. Frame rate will drop between 20 to 30 frames per second, but performance is near 100 most of the time. Cutscenes play out okay with minor hiccups, but also near the end of a cutscene, sometimes in the middle, the audio cuts off completely. And the third game has trouble keeping itself stable than the previous entries. It can't play well, but it has more slowdowns and stutters than the other games, so for anyone who cares about that sort of stuff, will be bothered by its results. These were the three games that didn't really go into full exploration, just the first levels in of itself. However, there's one game that actually put me by surprise, and it was definitely the toughest one to get working out of all the games shown here. Tekken 3. It almost works like it should. There's two different settings here you can try. One that uses the ordinary GPU settings, and the other is the U9. Unfortunately, you have to disable the X8 sound, much like rival Schools. The U9 GPU provides a better performance but has a low res look, but the other setting has a higher resolution setting but is a little slow and choppy.
Gecko, you win.
And why not? Let's throw in a bonus here. Final Fantasy IX. There used to be a Final Fantasy fix on the settings in this emulator, but now that only applies to tactics. But Final Fantasy IX seems to be doing alright. When roaming around, it's steady in between 25 to 30 frames per second at full speed. FMVs play okay with a couple stutters, and in-game cutscenes do well considering it's only text. And in battle, it's capped at 15 frames per second, and there are some slowdowns that happen, especially if you go into the results screen. Overall, it seems like you can get to the end of Final Fantasy IX on the Xbox no problem. This is also a franchise that never saw the light of day on the original Xbox until the 360 with Final Fantasy XIII. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a wrap. Let's go ahead and thank Xenon Xyanide for putting in this time to fixing up this emulator. None of this could have been done if it weren't for him. Amazing what this box can still do. The original Xbox is still a strong community, so let's keep that on live. And for those that don't care much about it, well, we'll still throw in some appreciation for you stopping by. And if there's still more games you'd like to see run on the original Xbox, it'd be an honor to keep these videos going. Now don't let me keep you on hold any longer. You still got a whole list of recommended videos to look after. You might see me again, so until then, salut.